not treated very well, and they're not very happy with their system and so forth. But did you know that the Ontario teachers are the highest paid teachers in North America? In fact, teachers in Canada are about 50% more, they earn about 50% more than the average teachers in the developed world, just looking at the developed world. But you'd think, and I pick on the teachers a little bit because you could do this with firemen, you could do this with policemen and so forth. But if you just look at the teachers, I have a little bit of fun there because these are supposed to be our educators. These are the ones that we entrust our children to. So you'd think these are very honest, decent, upstanding individuals that would respond to rational argument. Well, let's just look at the teachers' situation just briefly. Back in 1970, there were 10 teachers working for every retiree. And that's where you can see the square box with the green line joined. Today, there's 1.5 teachers working for every retiree. In 10 years, the teachers themselves say that it's going to be 1-to-1 under the current projections. 1-to-1. In 1970, the average teacher worked 27 years. They still work 27 years in 2012. The problem is, this is a good problem if you're a teacher, I guess, you're living longer. And so your retirement used to be 20 years and you work 27. Now you work 27, you're retired 32 years. So you're retired 20% longer than you work. And what this has resulted in is over $10 billion deficit, number one. But if you were actually to convert this whole teachers program from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, there's a $45 billion hole, which is 7% of the GDP of here in Ontario. Now, this is a plan, and again, I do not want to just pick on the teachers. I do it only because they're a good example, and there's it's hotly contested right now, and they are supposed to be our educators and should understand how a spreadsheet works and so forth. They have a pay package which is outrageous. Now, the fact that it was developed and promised, it shouldn't have been. I can't change that, but going forward, we can't afford this. And this is just an example of what has to be restructured in the public sector. And this is a serious problem, as you know. And I'm not even talking about the quality of education and so forth. I'm just talking about these pay packages. And so if you wanted to change this, we'd open this up, have a free market. You would definitely see prices change dramatically in terms of this. But is that going to happen? Well, not while you have unions that have no concern about the taxpayer, and I would argue very little concern about the children if they're going to bankrupt the province that they're operating in. That just makes no sense to me. So that's one issue. Other unfunded liabilities issue, I just put this up. There's many charts I could point to. We have socialized our healthcare system, as you know, and there's some great, it's great to be able to help people who are truly in need. This has gone beyond that, though, to helping people in catastrophic situations. This is a government that just promises, socialized all the healthcare costs, and there's no accountability to health. And so whether you pick on the United States, which these statistics come from, same thing throughout most of the developed world, we are a very sick group of people overall. And so the statistics, people aren't looking after their health. And so we've taken on a liability. It's just massive. There's a massive liability. And you just look at the increasing incidence of obesity and diabetes and all these different things that are coming along. Why is this happening? Again, undisciplined culture. Undisciplined culture, not taking a long-term view. It ultimately gets back to an ethical and moral issue. And then the other slide I'll just point out here, the growing dependence on the state. The state is becoming huge. I use food stamps here, but in the United States over the last 5 years, social welfare has increased by 60–70%. They expect, I just read an article this morning, that social welfare is going to go up another 80% in the United States over the next 10 years. Again, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's happening? This also gets down to moral and ethical issues. The breakup of the family, the irresponsibility of people, lack of accountability. You get into education, it gets back to why we're paying all these teachers for what they're earning and so forth. But it's a complex array of social, ethical, and moral factors that are just weighing us down in ways that our economy is not going to be able to take it. And that's my point. Then you look at the third issue here, demographics. And I think most of you are aware that there's serious demographic changes taking place in our culture. And what I find interesting here is if you're going to go into debt and you're going to spend beyond what you make and what you earn, you'd think that you'd want to at least be able to pass this off to some people that could take the debt. Well, you know, we've had a party and we haven't even reproduced enough people to take anywhere near the debt that we've racked up. And so our demographics throughout the developed world, and this isn't solved by immigration, which often people just go and say, well, it's immigration. No, the demographics are horrific in terms of the fall off in population when you run economies that assume perpetual growth. Okay? So if you look at the low fertility rates, abortion, undermining of the heterosexual family, coupled with you know, all sorts of family issues and so on, you're really getting societal collapse in a lot of our countries. And this is what I think makes this economic situation intractable, is that you can't run an economy if you're getting if you're in the midst of social collapse. And that's what we're in the midst of. And so you can look at, you know, I put this chart up here. If you have 1.2 children per woman, 100 grandparents leads to 18 and a half, just round up because we have to use whole numbers, 20 great-grandchildren. And that's what we're watching in a lot of countries. If you change that to 1.3 or 1.4, that's sort of the range you see most of our developed countries in. That goes from 100 to about 25 great-grandkids from looking at it in grandparents down to great-grandchildren. That's what we're living out right now. And we're starting to see that in our stats, and I'll give you a couple of stats. Now, if you're an economy grossly in debt and living beyond your means, and you've got a society that really is collapsing in terms of ethics, morality, children, number of children to support it, I would suggest you're in big trouble. And so when you look at the impact of the demographics, the workers per retiree, we used to average 5. Yeah, generally 5 not that long ago per retiree, 5 workers per retiree. We're now averaging around 3. Some countries like Japan are at 2. And we're seeing those lines as they come down. This is devastating for an economy. Every time you reduce even by 0.1 or 0.2 of a person against a retiree, it has massive economic consequences. You're also seeing this in the employment to population ratios. And these are the number of people working versus those who aren't working. And I wish when they did the unemployment rates, we could look at unemployment. What I'd like to know is how many people actually have full-time jobs in the private sector. That'd be a much more interesting number to me. How many people are working full-time in the private sector, in a competitive environment and competitive marketplace? Not including the government and how many social programs and how far the government's going in debt and hiring people and skewing all the numbers. But putting all that aside, if you just look at the number of people working in the population, given the aging population, less and less people are working. And so the ratio of workers to retirees is really plummeted over the last 5-6 years. Some of that due to, it's difficult to get a job and so forth. A lot of that's due to aging of the population and lack of jobs. So this is a very, again, concerning statistic because in the United States, the total number of people working is about the same as it was in the late 90s. But what happened to the debt? 5.7 trillion, remember 12 years ago? 16 trillion and growing at $1 trillion a year. This is not sustainable. This is a debt storm at the end of the day. Just a couple of quick slides. You can see the demographics in Europe. It's the black. The black is the individuals who are working as a percentage, and you can see that now that it reached a high about 2000, and the ratio of that age bracket where you really have the individuals fully employed is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Perhaps the most dramatic demographics that are occurring right now are in Japan. Japan is really an interesting case. You can see back in 1950, you can see they had a pretty healthy population distribution. 2005, so about 7 years ago, getting a little chubby in the middle, and we can see the aging of the population, and by 2050, they're completely inverted. Completely inverted. Well, they'll never, things will blow up a long time before that in Japan, but you can see the issues here. The other country that's really following on their heels, and you probably know what that is, that's China. And if you're reading the news, you know the Chinese leaders are getting very concerned because in 1979 they brought in the one child per family policy. And so their demographic profile and their distribution in ages is going to look just like this, if not worse. And that's a big problem for a country like China that is not overly affluent and still has to, and has taken on a lot of social commitments for its people. And so this is going to be a big issue for China. And I would ultimately argue that when you have financial problems and debt problems and socio-political problems and social problems, that this also can lead to geopolitical tensions and problems in the world, which we shouldn't be surprised at. And then I just put a slide up here. If you look at demographics, clearly have been impacted by the awfulness of abortion, which is probably one of the most heinous of activities that one can imagine. And you can see the statistics here in Canada. We're about 100,000 a year. China, well over 13, at least documented. In the United States, over 1 million a year. 53 million abortions since the early 70s in North America. About 3 to Canada, 50 in the United States. Just staggering statistics. That the safest place in the world should be the mother's womb is the most violent place in the developed world. And again, that tells you that a society that would increase and sanction that kind of violence is not a society that's going to have a strong, vibrant economy, ultimately, and care about the future. I put this slide up only to show what I've talked about, the secularization of the West. And this includes Russia and India and China, which have very liberal abortion laws, but the green shading are the countries that have the most permissive abortion laws. And the thing that should make us really weep here today is that this includes all of the traditional countries that were so influenced by the Protestant Reformation, which transformed these countries into powerhouses, both ethically, morally, politically, and economically. But you take North America, you take Northern Europe, you take Australia, all of these countries have the most permissive abortion laws. That's secularization in action. And that, my friends, means that we're going to have some challenges going forward. ZIRP, this would be the fourth of the 5 key challenges here. Zero interest rate policy. And let me just make a couple of quick observations in terms of this. What we've seen over the last number of years is with all this debt buildup, in order to keep the debt building, what have our central banks done? They just keep lowering interest rates so that debtors have an easier time of it. Because if someone wanted to give you $1 trillion, you say, I can't take $1 trillion. But if you didn't have any interest rate on it, as long as you didn't lose any of it, you could take $1 trillion and pay it back. And that's really the essence of what's going on amongst sovereign nations and countries. They've just taken interest rates down so far so they can just keep pumping debt into the system to keep this game going. And so there are implications to this, though, because a free market should determine interest rates, not a central bank. Because the market should determine the risk in terms of the economy. So what's happening? Big misallocation of capital. Money isn't going into the long-term projects that we really need in order to turn this thing around. Bond bubble. Everybody has bid the prices of bonds up, so bonds are way overvalued. And eventually, if interest rates start to reverse, there's going to be huge, huge losses amongst our financial institutions and our life insurance companies that own this stuff. Lack of savings and investment. People, because they can't make a return, aren't saving and investing to the same extent. And then also you have this massive transfer of wealth from savers to debtors. I'll articulate the size of that in a second. But what's happening is if you are saving, you're not getting anything for your money. And so you're actually subsidizing the debtors. So you're subsidizing what I would call the most irresponsible people in the society who ultimately need to have a little bit more of a whip to straighten them out to be able to solve this problem. So as I point out here on this slide, irresponsible and selfish people do not deleverage or take their debt down. They usually just keep borrowing more. And what's happened is by taking our interest rates down as low as they have, Canadians have borrowed more. Governments are all borrowing more. We're not borrowing less and trying to correct the problem. We're actually using this as an opportunity to keep spending more. So this is a big problem.